Still doing your reading. This week, what we're doing is we're going to be going from Abraham's death to Joseph, approximately the middle of the Joseph story. And so I wanted to go ahead and hit up a couple of tough questions out of this time. So one, Abraham had other kids. What? In Genesis 25, we see that Abraham marries a lady named Keturah and has a whole pile of children with her. So what happened with those kids? Are they kids of the promise? Is that fair? As an American, you would ask whether or not that's fair. It doesn't matter. That's not the question. What actually happens here is that you see that Abraham married Sarah. She was his first wife, his real wife. Isaac is the son of the promise that was promised to come from Abraham's body with Sarah. And so what you see in the Bible actually multiple times is that the first wife is considered the one that the husband is one flesh with her. That's why later on with Jacob and Leah, Judah, the heir, comes from Leah. Even though Rachel was the one who was originally contracted to marry him. So you see that one flesh coming over from Genesis chapter 2 further on into the narrative. So these kids, they are Abraham's kids. They are sent away to the east so that they won't kill their brother, because that's what humans are like. And they're sent away with presents so they will stay away in the east. Number 2, what's the deal with the birthright? So we have the story where Jacob steals the birthright from Esau. And we kind of ask, well, how is this happening? How can he just exchange his birthright for a bowl of stew? One thing is that these people commonly made oral agreements instead of written agreements. And so it wasn't like you could pass this on with a contract of like, here is my birthright, signed Esau. 2, what a birthright actually is that the oldest child was going to inherit a double portion of everything that the father had. And so when Esau comes in, the Hebrew says he despised his birthright. When he comes in, he's so hungry and he sees this plate of lentils and he exchanges something permanent for something temporary because he's hungry. So he gets his eyes off of what is real and true and permanent, and he puts them on that plate of lentils that will satisfy him right then. And so that's when he gives Jacob this oral agreement to change his birthright for the plate of lentils. Number 3, why do Esau's wives have different names here in Genesis 26 and 28 and later in Genesis 36? Does that mean the Bible is contradicting itself? I've actually seen this on an atheist website because they say, oh, the Bible's not true, we have this contradiction. Well, what you see here is probably like what I've experienced in Mexico, where I have a friend that has one name, but if they talk to somebody else, they have a different name, and if they talk to somebody else, they have another name. As Americans, we go by normally our first name, and that's our only name, and we don't feel the flexibility to change our names, but in other cultures, you actually can. What is entirely likely is that these ladies had different names. They had more than one name. So we see Anna, daughter of Bera, or something like that, but she could have a separate name depending on who she was talking to. Number 4, what's the deal with the sticks and the sheep? Jacob is out there, he's got Laban's flocks, he peels some sticks and puts them in front of the sheep, and the sheep bear different colored babies. That's weird. One of the things that we actually see is what Jacob is doing is he is actually doing selective breeding, or genetic manipulation, if we want to say. Except he's not thinking of it that way. He thinks that the sticks have something to do with the colors of the sheep, but he's actually breeding the sheep that way. So do the sticks actually control the color of the sheep? They do not. What Jacob is actually practicing is a form of magic, and you see that that's something that happens multiple times in his family, where they practice magic to try to manipulate their situation. It's the same thing that happens when Rachel tries to buy the mandrakes from Reuben. When you have ever seen that story and you're like, mandrakes, what's the deal? Mandrakes, they're a kind of a root, looks like a baby. You can't eat it. If you eat it, you'll hallucinate, you'll get poisoned. So they didn't just eat them. And Rachel was willing to exchange a night with Jacob to Leah for those mandrakes. Why? Because they look like a baby. They could be placed under the bed. They could be used as a sort of charm to try to attract babies and fertility. So what we see actually in the story of Jacob's family is this is a family that is very much in process of learning how to trust God. And so in the middle of the process, they keep going back to their old habits, such as magic. Question number 5. What's happening with the Dinah story? We have in Genesis the rape of Dinah. It's this story that suddenly comes in, and here's this poor woman who's treated like an object. She's treated like an object by Shechem, the prince of the city. She's treated like an object by her brothers, that she's the seat of their family honor. And so we just see this is part of the story of women. Life outside of the garden is bad for women. Women are treated as objects by their families, by others, and that's what happens with Dinah. We also see that her brothers become exactly what they despise in their search for vengeance, because they're not looking for justice, they're looking for vengeance. They kill an entire city, and they carry the women away with them. What do you think they did with the women? Exactly what Shechem had done with Dinah. It is a testimony to God's grace and love to this family, that he stays with them despite their violence and evil. Question number 6. Why do we see Esau's family included in these genealogies? We have multiple generations of Esau's family, of the Edomites, of others. One of the things that we see is that these people legitimately kept living near one another. They kept close to one another. They kept up with one another. They knew when people were born and when people died. It's like people living in the country, and it's another proof for the fact that the Bible is a real book of history written at a certain time and actually happened, because people were still keeping up with each other. If we were going to construct that narrative, we would leave that information out, but God includes it. What we also see is that it's entirely possible that the Eliphaz in the genealogy of Esau, who had a son named Teman, could be Eliphaz the Temanite from the book of Job. And so we see that perhaps that's a connection between those stories, and it grounds Job in the greater biblical narrative as well. Number 7, how can Joseph's brothers just sell him? Well, if you think about it, a couple of chapters before, they walked into a city full of vulnerable people, men who had just been circumcised, and they killed every single one of them in cold blood. How hard is it to sell your brother after you've already gone that far in your sin? That's a hard heart. And again, we see this evidence of a really dysfunctional, sinful, violent family that God stays faithful to because he's made promises, not because they're good. Number 8, Judah and Tamar. We have this story where Judah ends up sleeping with his daughter-in-law Tamar to produce an heir. What's the deal? One, I think that that's put where it is in the narrative to have a contrast between Joseph's morality, Joseph's desire to follow God, because where would Joseph possibly have found any kind of an example of purity or self-control or righteous dealings with women in his family? Nobody, not Jacob, not Judah, nobody. So I think it's a contrast to Joseph. I also think that it's there to give the kind of background for the levirate marriage, so that the man dies and his brother can marry his widow and produce heirs for him. And I also think that it shows you a lot about the plight of women and how all of their future depended on their ability to produce an heir. And so we see that part of the anxiety of Tamar is she has to produce a child in order to have a future. And again, that takes us back outside of our American culture, because for us, children are not insurance. But for a traditional society, your children are your health insurance, your life insurance. They're your future. That's who's going to take care of you, and that's who's going to propagate your name from generation to generation, which was important for them and is less important for us. So I hope these answers have been helpful. I hope these are the questions you're asking, and if you're not, feel free to email us with other questions. Thank you.